Hi there and welcome. Today I want to share some thoughts on Karen Rees, Head of Nursing at the Countess of Chester during the period Miss Letby was unfortunate enough to be employed there. I'm guessing that she is a divisive figure among us supporters of Miss Letby. For the more generous souls, one of the few professionals it could be grudgingly conceded to come out of the whole affair up to now with any credit. For others, the worst of the betrayers not actually active in the frame-up. For me, she's simultaneously both. But on the principle that in life, where you end up is what is important, not where you started, or the circuitous route you took to get there, I choose to focus on the former persona, not the latter. On that basis, Karen Rees is a study in redemption. In and of itself, that is something worthy of comment, both in recognition of the individual for having made that journey, and to generally celebrate the fact that the world is, in consequence of that one individual journey, by an infinitesimal amount admittedly, a more honest and less ugly place. Up to a few short weeks ago, Karen Rees wasn't even a name I would have readily associated with the case. I think she is mentioned in Rachel Aviv's famous New Yorker article, but only in passing in the course of Ms. Aviv's description of the British media's central role in the demonizing of Miss Letby. I think the point was about the camera artfully panning away from the visible emotion on Rees's face as she wrestled with the idea, in what must have been the denunciation interview, of someone having such capacity for dissimulation as to be able to cry at every meeting over a 2-year period. The name only really registered with me from a comment on an earlier video to the effect that Miss Letby had declined a request to visit her from this woman. I didn't even make the connection with the New Yorker article, just making a mental note at the time that her role in Miss Letby's case was an area of ignorance to be addressed when opportunity presented itself. That opportunity then presented itself with a report I encountered of an interview Karen Rees had given to the Sunday Times and what she'd had to say in that interview with the Sunday Times. My initial impression in reading that report was that she wasn't to be fully trusted, as she evidently wasn't giving full disclosure on some events, suggesting that while it could not be denied that she boarded and travelled, she might well have gotten off the redemption train a stop or two before its final destination. As will become apparent, I now realize that perception was an error resulting from not taking the time to read between the lines, no pun intended. I am now satisfied that Karen Rees has in fact fully committed to her better self in this matter, making her story a complete one of redemption. In such circumstances, I would normally have the pleasure of simply bookmarking the story in my memory for future random, feel-good repeat visits, but not this time. This is because the question of the absence of full transparency remains, and it is now clear to me that the lack of full transparency begins and ends with her inability to identify or speak openly about the hinted at external coercive force behind her August 2023 betrayal of Miss Letby. Karen Rees appears withholding only because, even in now openly defying the restrictions of that coercive force on her conscience, she is clearly having to choose her words very carefully. The absence of any direct speech from her on the subject in the report I read strongly suggests also that the reporter is also mindful of the same constraint. The undoubtedly sordid nature of that coercion is of less interest than the actual source of the coercion. Reason tells me that this source cannot have been the Countess of Chester NHS Trust, which would have no control over her pension or other financial arrangements. And it is not Cheshire Constabulary. Like it or not, crypto-communism as the only means of giving the corporatocracy its financial welfare state at the expense of the ordinary taxpayer, is now the only governance game in town. But that freedom from legal and judicial constraint hasn't quite trickled down as far as local law enforcement yet. No, the power which coerced Karen Rees came from higher up the food chain. It is a now all too familiar spectre of unseen, unknown, and unacknowledged hands in the framing of Miss Letby and the subsequent guiding of those fraudulent charges through to a successful conviction. The thing that convinced me it was time to put on the conspiracy realist hat is one astonishing circumstance of Karen Rees' betrayal. The fact that she was at that point 5 years retired and, having been head of nursing, presumably on a very good final salary-based pension, and therefore financially independent. She lives on a farm with her husband. As I see it, in these circumstances, the first duty is to ask the questions. These days, that is often all you can do. The other reason it is worthwhile spending a bit of time on the Karen Rees aspect is that for me it highlights better than any other two things which, if not acknowledged and addressed by all of us in our own lives, means the next Lucy Letby is a question of when rather than if. Those two things are the tame abdication of responsibility by otherwise good people who sat on their hands hoping for the best when they should have been going to war in an administrative sense, and secondly, the degree of localized collective insanity then permitted to run unchecked up there in northwest England between the hospital and the local police force, which, against all the odds, was able to stitch together a Frankenstein's monster of a case. A Frankenstein's monster which an ethically compromised, morally disengaged, and I suspect opportunistic CPS then had no compunctions about giving judicial life to by any means necessary. Bear with me about the collective insanity, and I hope you will come to see what I'm talking about. Karen Rees states in a Sunday Times interview, where all the information I speak of apparently first appeared a few weeks ago, that she first met with Miss Letby in the summer of 2016 to tell her, I quote, "I've been given a management instruction that I have to remove you from your clinical practice," end quote. She further stated, "What I saw was a frightened woman who was shocked and bewildered." She gives information that she was shocked and sympathetic to see the broken woman before her, but that she had a job to do. Sometime, it appears shortly afterwards, Rees was given a further instruction by management to meet with Miss Letby on a weekly basis to check her well-being. These meetings would continue without interruption for almost 2 years up to her retirement. Rees describes these meetings as shocking, expanding that Miss Letby was crying, very distressed every time we met, with her saying things like, "Why is this happening to me?" and "I'm not going to let them drive me out of the job that I love. I worked hard. I've done nothing wrong." Karen Rees is quoted as saying, she cried in my arms on a weekly basis. It was harrowing. So worried was she that Miss Letby had become suicidal that she recruited others to set up a WhatsApp support group for her. Rees gives an example of one of her own messages on that group chat. Quote, "Hang in there, girl. Your nursing team are fully behind you. We will get through this." This brings us to what I said about collective insanity. Karen Rees was not meeting with Miss Letby for personal reasons, but in her professional capacity as head of nursing under direct instruction from hospital management. Having given her that task, I do not doubt that she was expected to keep them in the loop as to Miss Letby's condition, and did so with formal on-the-record updates for the protection of all concerned. After all, for the first 9 months of that investigation, a suicide by a nurse suspended because of a wild goose chase of a police investigation initiated in the most dubious of circumstances was a distinctly possible final outcome. We therefore have a situation where a young woman suspected, against all evidence, including expert investigations initiated for review of that evidence, of harming babies, is reacting exactly as one might expect or predict a blameless and persecuted individual to react in such circumstances. The evidence of her mental unraveling is such that it is deemed necessary to put an extraordinary safeguarding measure in place on top of counseling sessions with a therapist. Nothing Karen Rees reported back could have been construed as giving one iota of support to the idea that this young woman was anything other than what she always appeared to be. I do not doubt that the mysterious unnamed head of occupational health would have made similar reports. Had that not been the case, we would have certainly been made aware of the fact on or shortly after 18th August 2023. So hospital management knew that Miss Letby, entirely consistent with what was happening to her, was a broken woman, but did the police? Well, having engineered the police investigation, we can be certain that his primary objective having been achieved, Jairam would have quietly retreated back from his position of being the primary lobbyist of Cheshire Constabulary, to leave Tony Chambers and the executive team as the first point of contact or informant for the police investigators. Is it conceivable that the police would have taken an interest in gathering information about the nurse Jairam had more or less told them was their serial killer? I think so. Crime investigation is an information game. There is no such thing as too much information for a detective on a case. They would have sought that information, and any reluctance on the part of Tony Chambers, the chief executive, to share it would have been swiftly overcome by citing operational considerations, which would have been claimed to make the information pertinent. On top of that, even before her arrest, it is almost certain that, with the previously undreamt of freedom that the authorities now have to walk all over individual privacy in crypto-communist UK, they would have forced her GP to give access to her medical records and therefore been aware that she was so far gone as to even be on medication. In all likelihood, they would have had so potentially big a fish as a possible serial killer under surveillance from the beginning of their investigation anyway, and therefore been tracking her trips to the chemist and making follow-up inquiries as to the purpose of those visits. There is therefore no scenario where the police and hospital management did not have exactly the same knowledge of Miss Letby as Karen Rees. Essentially, that she was nothing more and nothing less than a blameless young woman, utterly bewildered as to why her life was rapidly disintegrating around her. Everything about her life screamed those painfully obvious facts, but the backstabbing and truly repugnant Gilby, the specially selected on-message replacement for Tony Chambers and her partners in crime over at Cheshire Constabulary, somehow contrived to act as though they were dealing with Hannibal Lecter, then went touting the story of their collective insanity to media companies in pursuit of fame and fortune. To return to Karen Rees, after relating the WhatsApp support group information, her narrative to the Sunday Times then seems to skip forward a few years. Now, when first reading it, reflecting on what profilers say about gaps in a person's story being a red flag, I initially viewed this as with suspicion before recalling that she did, after all, retire in March 2018. And on top of that, Miss Letby relocated back to the parental home in Hereford sometime after her first arrest in July of 2018. Anyway, Karen Rees then gave information that she wanted to attend the trial, but was prevented from doing so as she was a potential witness. That to me cried out for further elaboration, or at least a brief cover note of explanation, but neither was forthcoming. As a quick aside, if that is taken at face value, as she has the right to demand we do, then in September of 2022 she was still in Miss Letby's corner. The next piece of information she gave was that she offered to give evidence for the defense but was never called. Now, without going off on a huge digression, the question must be asked as to why the defense, having made the decision to go quick and dirty by pointedly calling no medical experts, would then turn up its nose at easily the most powerful character witness available in all the circumstances. What can certainly be said is that the rejection of her as a witness by the defense means that it was the prosecution that found it necessary to abuse procedural rules by cynically listing her on some kind of standby witness list and thus prevent her from being present at the trial. They'd stacked the jury with female jurors to maximize the leverage to be had from the vulnerability of the neonate victims, but had recognized it as potentially the most double-edged of all swords. The last thing they wanted was the higher emotional IQ of those 8 female jurors kicking in over the weeks and months, such that they could begin testing the veracity of Johnson KC's lies by quietly studying the facial reactions to them of other women who the jurors could guess had intimate knowledge of both the case information and the actual clinical practices being described. Miss Letby's former colleagues, all cheap, new young nurses with the emphasis on the cheap, obviously still employed, therefore could simply be told not to go or face the career consequences. Karen Rees, having retired, Karen Rees was retired, so they had to go a different route to keep her from becoming a potential source of information to the sharper jurors. Karen Rees next made the point that she always believed Miss Letby to be innocent. My response to that was a quizzical, how could she not? It seemed a redundant point to make. But on further reflection, perhaps it was just her means of signaling that which she remains unable to state openly, that she was under coercion at the time she did the next thing she mentions, the post-verdict denunciation of Miss Letby. Given that it is the pivotal and defining event of Karen Rees' narrative, it is more than curious that the description of it does not include a direct quote of what she said. The language used in the report is passive and neutral, and the phrasing equivocal. I quote, "Rees was advised to publicly denounce Miss Letby and did," end quote. We then return to the use of direct quotations in relating that denunciation. I quote, "Very convincing. I now know that this was a calculated and successful attempt to make me believe her story, and I was deceived." When encountering this report for the first time a few days ago, my original intention had been to speculate at this point that Karen Rees' confidence in herself as a woman must have somehow got lost somewhere along the way for her to be able to do this to Miss Letby at the very point she had to know that she was at her most acutely vulnerable. I now see that it would not be fair to call into question any aspect of her personal character in relation to her susceptibility to the coercion she signals, and the reporting of her denunciation all but confirms. Whatever lever was used, it was plainly one powerful enough to get the job done. Enough said. The only speculation that seems appropriate is that Karen Rees has succeeded in making whatever change to her life or her circumstances was necessary to reduce the effectiveness of whatever lever was used to force her compliance to the narrative back in August 2023. I'm genuinely happy for her and also congratulate her on the achievement. Okay, so that's what I had to say today. As usual, feel free to share your own thoughts and any information you think might be of interest in the comments below. And again, as usual, thank you for watching, thank you for your time, and all the best.